Good morning, Dade City Garden Club. This is Madonna Wise, your historian. I'm so delighted to be here today, and I appreciate the invitation to be able to talk with you about my newest book, A Haunted History of Pasco County. And it's really not goofy at all. It's really a history of our local area. This is a monumental week for all of us, particularly as women. I feel like I should be wearing my pearls and my white color to represent the suffragettes. And also in these interesting times, let me say God bless you, and let's hope that everyone stays well and safe. We were able to get our first COVID vaccination yesterday, and we're delighted about that. And we hope and pray that there will be a new normalcy very soon. At this point, I'm going to try and walk us through a PowerPoint, and I shall be here. We're going to have questions at the end, but please bear with me in terms of the technology. Thank you. As you know, I've been in the business of local history for a long time. You might say I've been in the business of local history for my entire life because I love understanding the origins of things. I love understanding why we are who we are and how we got here. And of course, I am an educator by background. This is the cover of the new book, and I'm going to share just a little bit about the book in the book trailer. History. Every one of you out there has a very unique history, and I would encourage you to preserve it. Give a sense of the flavor of your life for your family ancestors in writing in a journal, recording stories, all kinds of things that you can do. One of the books I wrote in the past is called Wildcat Creek Stories. And I'm so glad I did it because now I think I would have forgotten all the stories, but they were stories that my dad told me in Indiana growing up around the Wildcat Creek area, and just little vignettes that I've been able to share occasionally with my grandchildren. One of the things that I did a few years ago was to create a recipe book. My mother was an extraordinary cook, and she ran a restaurant in Indiana. And after she passed away, I had all of these boxes of recipe cards. So as you can see with two of my grandchildren here, they're making one of the recipes from the book. This was just a really fun, exciting way to record history because, you know, food is involved with history. And for all of the recipes, I had memories. So I was able to include photographs and information about our family. We ended up actually publishing the book because my mother was particularly well known for her pies. So many people in the community wanted to get copies of her pie recipes. One of my really good friends, Kathy Rapp, also did a recipe book for her extraordinary Italian family, and this is what it looks like. Just a really fun way. You know, those recipe cards are worth everything to us in terms of memories. Another special thing that we've done to preserve history is pressing flowers. My husband, Ernie, who has a background in botany and taught biology and botany for many years, has a lot of collections and herbariums around the country because he particularly likes plant taxonomy. But one of the things he did was to preserve my wedding bouquet. And it's a simple process. It was 1 part mule team borax and 2 parts cornmeal. And the thing is in perfect condition, and even the color is in beautiful shape. But we also have, we've done a lot of pressing of plants over time as well. So it's a nice way to preserve memories. Just recently in the newsletter, I had the opportunity to share a couple of heirloom plant stories. One was that of extraordinary Tiny Mobley Bozeman, who was the treasurer of the garden club at a really extraordinary time, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that later. But one of our new members, who's a special young lady in my life, Mary Catherine Mason Sauter, lives at Tiny's house. And she shared with me that she really enjoys the beautiful lilies and the azaleas and so on. think about those plants, ladies, that will be preserved beyond our times, and sharing the stories will be so very meaningful. I ran across this beautiful story that our city councilman, Scott Black, wrote about his trilby rose bush. Definitely an heirloom rose, but if you haven't read the story, I would invite you to do it. Scott Black is definitely a treasure for us in Dade City, but the story he writes about propagating that rose bush is just priceless. Trips to the museum. We have some wonderful local museums. Recently, I took my 8-year-old daughter before COVID to the Tampa History Center. They had a wonderful exhibit on bricks, and they did it based on Legos. And then she was 7 years old. My beautiful granddaughter Blakely and I spent the day there along with Ernie, and we just had a wonderful time. One of my really funny stories was when I said, we have to eat at the Columbia Cafe in the museum, and how about you have a Cuban sandwich? And she said she's never had a Cuban sandwich in her life. And when I told her dad, my son, about that, he said, I make them all the time. But the things you learn from kids. But I would say sharing stories with your children and your grandchildren about the family and how you got to be who you are, understanding the purposes and traditions of objects and practices, maybe the old dial telephone. Genealogy. Anybody that needs any help with genealogy, I'm again addicted to genealogy, but I'll be glad to help you. Record your story. How many of us wish that we had recorded a story for our family members? This is Blakely at the Lego exhibit. She loved the exhibit of the tea at the Boston Harbor. And not to be outdone, I have to share the stories of my other grandchildren. We have 4 grandchildren. And there is James on his first lead line class at the Tampa Equestrian Center, and all 4 of my extraordinary grandchildren at a birthday party right at the very beginning of COVID, an outdoor birthday party. But we talk about history all the time. I want you to keep in mind that history is idiosyncratic. It's going to be different for you than it is for me, even though there is factual information and we use primary sources whenever we can. But as a history teacher, I was never one to teach about the wars or have my students memorize dates. I always wanted them to understand the essence of the time, the people, the customs, what made us who we are today. One of my favorite people in terms of documenting history is Ken Burns. Recently he said, amnesia is spreading in terms of history. People can tell you, particularly children can tell you, or teens can tell you 5 different brands of blue jeans, but they can't name 5 different presidents. It's just essential that we do share history on the national, international level, and even our personal historical experiences. Okay, so what about the extraordinary Dade City Garden Club? Oh, it has a phenomenal history. It was established in 1947, and this is our founder, Thelma Gilbert. Thelma Gilbert was quite an interesting lady. I have photos of her house, and it's still in great shape. But she was the daughter, along with her, she had 2 sisters. All 3 of them were members of the Dade City Garden Club. And she was the daughter of the founder of the person that founded the Coca-Cola plant in Dade City, which is right there, which would have been right there to the left of A Matter of Taste. And for those of you that grew up in Dade City, I know you can tell us about field trips to the Coca-Cola plant. That was 74 years ago. Can you believe it? We celebrated our 70th anniversary just a few years ago, but bread was 12 cents. Gasoline was 15 cents a gallon. The dues for the club were $1.50. Ooh, inflation. The president was Harry Truman. The buck stops here. And one of my favorite movies came out that year, It's a Wonderful Life. Different time, different place, but still the same wonderful community that has evolved and changed a bit. Here are a couple of pictures of Dade City in that period of time. You might remember Gail Stout and I did a presentation for the 70th anniversary, and we talked to a couple of the people at the Tampa History Museum, and they shared with us that period of time was right after World War II, and lots of things were happening and changing. So some history of the Dade City Garden Club. It started in 1947. There were five circles at one time. And I think probably they did their first flower show in 1949 at the Women's Club. They were really involved in environmental beautification, all kinds of things. But very soon they started looking for a location, and they found a piece of property on Meridian that had been part of a golf course. It was from the Henry family, and they set out to purchase it. They purchased it for, I want to say, $9,000. It was $1,000 down and $75 a month plus interest. Things have changed a bit. And one of the really fun things was the mortgage burning ceremony in 1966. And here's some of the gals, along with Thelma, that got together and they actually burned the mortgage. The next project began in 1966, and Inez Jeter, who was the president at that time, started working with, started looking for, it had been happening for a while, but they started looking for a location. And about that time, St. Rita's Catholic Church was in the process of building a new building. St. Rita's had been a mission church. It's always been a diverse church in terms of demographics. Started in 1913, and they realized that that might be a possibility. They were going to sell the church, but they decided, St. Rita's decided to donate it to the Dade City Garden Club. Okay, but challenges will be, they donated the building, and then they had to work with Tico because they had to move that church all the way through Dade City, and that was not an easy feat. I believe they cut down, or they had to trim 4 trees. It was quite a process, and we do have pictures of the moving of the actual building in 1977. Can you imagine? It was moved by a Lakeland moving company, and here they are going right through Dade City. Wow. And there are pieces of it, they had to take the steeple off of it. Soon the ladies were busy with decorating and renovation, and they had to borrow, again, they borrowed $10,000 and worked on the renovation. In this period of time, we were featured in a national magazine article in the Florida Gardener in 1983 because we were somewhat unique in having a historical location like this. Michael Giella held the mortgage for us for the renovation, and by golly, by 1986, those ladies had paid off that $10,000 mortgage, and again, they had a mortgage burning ceremony. In the intervals since that period of time, I would say 1986, the Garden Club has been involved in the city in all kinds of things, but probably my favorite story is that of 1997, when they were beginning the renovation, and marvelous Sylvia Young, one of our commissioners, county commissioners for many years, a great friend to the Garden Club, was proposing this wonderful renovation of the historic courthouse. And at the time, not looking maybe too forward, as a county at that time, things were changing and changing quickly. They proposed to cut down the beautiful grandfather oaks, but we would not have it. One of the leaders of that was Catherine Deal, and you see her here as she's tying a ribbon around the tree. And there were all kinds of signs that were posted on those beautiful oak trees. That was the period of time with tie a yellow ribbon around the old oak tree, and we used it as our own motto. but we persevered. And I think it shows the fortitude of a group of women who believe strongly in a purpose. So I wanted to share with you just a little bit about the surrounding area. You got just a little tiny taste of the Dade City Garden Club history. There's so much more. There are volumes of scrapbooks and memorabilia and the awards and the wonderful flower shows. And a lot of that we've been able to put on 5a.org. My wonderful friend there, Jeff Miller, retired math teacher, has this site, 5a.org, and he has our videos and a lot of our artifacts there. Okay, but let's talk about Pasco County just for a minute. So you have the framework of where we are. First thing I want to mention is that we are not new to the area. Indigenous people have been here for over 14,000 BC years, and we tend to think that we were the frontiersmen, and a lot of our history is focused on that because we don't have photographs, we don't have written records of that period of time. But the indigenous people we're here. And the artifacts, the lithics that are found are often repurposed. You will see what I would have called an arrowhead that actually originated 10,000 years ago that was repurposed by the Seminoles. And we've got some really great people that have documented this. Again, the first people during the Ice Age, you know about the land bridge and also the three periods of the indigenous culture. We know a lot of this because the mounds, the Indian mounds, exist throughout the county. I'll be telling you about our most well-known mound, but as I was doing the research on this, I was told by person after person that there were shell mounds and there were burial mounds. And the one that exists still in Newport Richey, right on the water, is probably the most well-reserved in the area. I heard not too long ago that Dade City was a railroad town, and I said, not a railroad town. Yeah, railroads did influence the history, but it began with Fort Dade, and that was a patent of 160 acres in 1842. And a lot of it was the lure of the Withlacoochee River, which is such a phenomenal resource, and also the newly built Fort King Road in 1825, which allowed settlers to begin coming into the area. All of the communities, and I'm just going to mention a little bit about Dade City, Zephyrhills, and Wesley Chapel, since that's probably our most predominant area. But all of these were affected by the land grants, and then later on by homestead. So we had a lot of people coming here to get homestead land. In Zephyrhills, I tend to think of Dade City as a beautiful, pristine southern town, kind of an antebellum town in many ways, and I don't mean that in a Civil War kind of way, but the classic area that you would think of traditional Southern culture. But down the road, we had Zephyrhills, and Zephyrhills evolved primarily, it was also from a land developer, it was more the railroad town in some ways, because Simon Temple bought it from the Florida Railway and Navigation Corporation, and it was originally called Abbott and then later Abbott Station. But it really gets underway in 1910 when a retired captain from the Union, the Civil War, the Union, purchased several hundred acres of land and began the Zephyrhills Colony Company. When I was teaching history, I used to say to my students, did you know that Zephyrhills was settled by a Union soldier officer? And they would go, no, Mrs. Wise, it had to be Confederate. but I always enjoy telling them. I'm particularly proud of Captain Jeffries because he commanded a Black troop in the Civil War, and he was certainly an honorable gentleman. And many of you know that his house still stands in Zephyrhills, and I'll be talking about that a little bit later because it's known for some ghostly things. The third area that many of you are familiar with is Wesley Chapel. And when I would say there's the pristine Southern community, there's the more homesteaded colony of Civil War soldiers, because they hosted the Grand Army of the Republic for many years, and they had reunions of the Union Army and so on. But the third community is rustic frontier Florida with wilderness. And there were only 12 settlers in the first census that they did, but they arrived in 1840. It was often known as Gatorville. It had all kinds of names, but and primarily the center of the town was in the area where the Quail Hollow golf course is today. But it has probably the most vigilante, primitive history of anywhere. Pasco County itself was established in 1887, and it was from a region of Hernando County. There was a big dispute over the county seat, but the county seat was established in 1887. Just wanted to talk a little bit about some of the historic places. The The 1909 courthouse is probably one of the most treasured locations, and we'll be talking about a couple of events that happened there. It's classic Southern architecture. The designer and the builder is responsible for many similar. We had 4 different depots in the area over time. We all are familiar with the one on the bypass, but there was a previous one that was near there, and there were 2 in downtown Dade City. That is to say, one replaced another. And here are 2 of the 2 original locations. One was for passengers, and the other was for produce. And here are the replacement buildings. The one on the right would have stood right in front of the Edwinola. I think it's really important because it's related really to the whole horticulture, agricultural thing, but we know that Pasco Packing was the largest citrus packing plant in the world, and it permeated the culture. I never do a presentation on Dade City when I don't talk to people about the aroma of the oranges over time, because it used to be when you drove through Dade City, you would have the aroma of the oranges. Also, it's good to mention that we also had the largest private citrus packing plant, and that was Evans Packing in Dade City. Just a minute, my dog is deciding to chew things up at the moment. One of my favorite buildings in Dade City is the jailhouse. It's the oldest brick building, and I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go along. It's an extraordinary building, and it was so well preserved by Buddy Jones, who owned it for many years. I like this one that has the little key to Plant City, Tampa, Bushnell, Ocala. Again, our beautiful area. Ernie and I documented, and we spent many weeks on photographing the houses in Dade City. We used the Chamber of Commerce's guide, and I would just want to mention, I do in my latest book have some of the historical houses, but we have the treasure trove of historical houses in Dade City. There's not another place in Pasco County that compares with it. In Zephyrhills, I think we have 2. In Wesley Chapel, I've been able to find 2 historical buildings, and one is the Turpentine Foreman House, and the other is an old barn. But there are virtually no priceless houses like those of Dade City. And I would invite you, if you wanted to take a look at my Dade City book, or you wanted to pick up one of the Chamber of Commerce walking guides, you will find that the houses are in 4 geographical regions. One includes Meridian Avenue, which has the Garden Club included on it. Also, the Extraordinary Church. It's actually technically Church Avenue. We all call it Church Street. 5th Street, and then I call it Cosmopolitan Dade City, but that's right downtown Dade City, where you can get the history of many of the locations there and the preceding buildings that were there as well. Along the way, I've spent a lot of time on history. This is Wayne Sweat and David Brown, and they spent a lot of time telling me stories. And that's kind of how I got to this crazy thing of writing a book on haunted history or premonitions, superstitions, that kind of thing. I spent a lot of time, this was an interview that we did with the Tampa Bay Times, but they particularly talked about the Fifth Sunday Sing. They talked about the importance of the general store and all kinds of things about music and culture and food and language and tradition, and particularly the cohesiveness of the 3 communities. Another person I spent a lot of time with, and I was going to share some video clips of these folks, but they didn't, the sound is not real great on my videos. But this is Anna Jo Bracknell. She's a retired educator. She was a Miss Zephyrhills at one time. And she's the mother of Stephanie Black, the curator of the Pioneer Museum. But she was also the daughter of the most renowned rattlesnake and gator hunter in the area, Lonnie Tucker. And she just shared all kinds of stories for me. 2 other people, 96-year-old Lillian Stanley and her son Marco Stanley. He's a police officer in Gainesville, and they spent many, many hours with me. I think one of my favorite stories from them was when Lillian told me how she could do the cracker whip, and was just an extraordinary person in terms of women's history. They knew the families, and I think work ethic was a strong factor here. Lillian has since passed away, but she was 96 here, and she spent several hours in which we taped conversations. Why do I mention this? I mention this because this is where I got a lot of my stories. It was from colloquial tales that people shared with me. In 2018, History Press, after having done 3 local history books and a couple of other history books for self-publishing, approached me about adding to their genre of haunted history. And actually, a couple of my historian friends said, "Are you crazy? You're pretty well known for research and documentation," and I do very, very much value that. But I was also invited several times by Rotary clubs and the Pasco organizations to do little talks for Halloween or just folklore kinds of things. And I had accumulated a lot of different stories. So after some convincing, I decided I would go ahead and work on a haunted history of Pasco County. And I had pretty strong parameters about what it was going to be like. It wasn't going to be about paranormal. It was going to be about our feelings and our beliefs and our intuitions that sometimes affect our lives. So that's how this whole thing got started. And I was working on it in January of 2020. I was pretty much into the organization of it, and I had identified some of the communities I was going to work on. I'd done a few interviews, and wowie, March hit. And I was just completely consumed with this book and another book that I worked on. Again, We learn history through stories. The other book that I worked on is called Preacher Woman. It's my first full-length novel. It's a fairly long novel, but it's about a woman that I encountered in my genealogy search. She was a woman evangelist. There weren't many in the late 1800s. Her name was Lydia Nice. And because I can be a bit obsessive in my research, I could not quit researching Lydia Nice. She also experienced breast cancer, and she had an extraordinary surgery. She went back to preaching. She was just a phenomenal woman that I found in genealogy. She's not a relative, but somewhat one I really liked. And interestingly enough, that was a wonderful parallel for a haunted history, because her sense of caring, her sense of compassion, her kind of off the wall life, and it was a very short life, impacted me and sort of gave me an opportunity to finish haunted history. And I finished both of these books in summer. So in the book, you will find tales, folklore, mystery, premonition, superstition, and I think a lot of it's infused by humor. A person that is really well known for his knowledge of haunted history in our area is William Dayton, Esquire, Bill Dayton, who he is the best storyteller I've ever encountered. And in the research of this book, I often would write up different segments about houses or location or stories that I was told, and then I would mail them to Bill, and then we would talk by phone, sometimes for hours, in editing the information. If you haven't had the experience of meeting Bill, you should. He lives very close to downtown, and he is a person, unlike myself, who retains every piece of detailed information. A lot of the information he collected for a presentation he did in 2003 for the Pasco County Historical Society, which I would encourage any of you to be involved in, as well as the Pasco County Genealogical Society. And also Zephyrhills has a historical association, which is phenomenal. But I included this little article about the day the elevator stuck, because I was working on the courthouse and I wanted to tell the story of that extraordinary feeling that you have with that courthouse. Bill shared with me a couple of different situations where people were trapped in the elevator. If you've been in that elevator, you know it's small. And this is to say that we did a lot of laughing, a lot of tales, a lot of phenomenal things. I want you to meet Bill if you haven't met him already, and so I'm going to have him share just a little bit of information, and you'll get a feel for Bill Dayton, the historian's historian.
She set out from Dade City. chairs just in case somebody.
Well, how interesting. I hope you get a flavor for Bill Dayton and his detailed memory. He shared so many wonderful stories for me, and I'm going to just share a fun one about him. My book features stories from 15 different communities in Pasco County, and at the beginning of each section, you'll get a history of that area. I did filter these stories so that you will learn some history as you read the stories, and I try not to include salacious stories that were not pretty much factual. When I was working on San Antonio and St. Leo, that area, which is so rich in history, I kept hearing this story about the nun that had been murdered. And it seemed to be a pretty profound story, but I finally ended up saying to my friend Bill, what about this story? And he just laughed and laughed and laughed. And he said, I made up that story when I was a student at the parochial school that was there at St. Leo. And the story has taken on a life of its own, he and his buddy. That's the kind of fella he is, and he's wonderful. Okay, so the 15 different communities, I'm going to give you just a sampling of a few of the stories now, and I'll try to move through this quickly. And I would invite you to read the book, share with me any other stories you might have, and any reactions you have. Probably, as I mentioned before, we're going to talk a little bit about the Native Americans because they were in the entire area, and there are beliefs that if you interfere with the mounds, the burial mounds in particular, that is not a kosher kind of thing to do. Probably one of my favorite stories I got from Bill and also from documentation, but it's Francis Longhorn Dade. Of course, that's where Dade City got its name, and he was involved in the Seminole Wars, and he made a famous march from the fort that is now Tampa down Fort King Road, and they camped at an area, which I'll tell you about in just a minute, on Christmas Day in 1835. And it's said that Dade had been in the War of 1812, and that particular night, some people think he may have indulged a bit in some spirits, but that's not really well documented. But that night he had a huge premonition. He saw the soldiers from 1812 marching, and he he shared this with the other soldiers, supposedly. And of course, we know that at a short time later, there was a massacre at what is now, and you'll see the monument that is at near Bushnell, where we have Fort Dade, and that the place where he fell. It is considered, there's a monument at West Point, it's considered very similar to Custer's Last Stand, although it's viewed a bit differently in history. The area that he camped at is where Hillside Terrace Apartments now exist. And there were a great many Indian artifacts collected there over time. And we also know that the Massey House was there, and it is the subject of a lot of ghost stories as well. They're in the book, so you can read those. This is the reporter from the Tampa Tribune, Jan Glidewell, who spent an entire night outside the Stockton Massey House to try to document ghosts there. Ernie and I walked around this property. It's a beautiful property. Also, there's a Florida Medical Center building on that property as well. But when you talk about history, we've got several different layers of history there, and all have kind of interesting ethereal type stories that go along with them. This is a more modern picture of the Stockton Massey House. This is the Olsner Mound that I mentioned, which is in Newport Richey, right on the water. It's close to the Johnny Cash vacation home, but it is an extraordinary example of a burial mound. And it was owned by a private family for many years, but it is now owned through the extraordinary Alice Hall, the historian from Zephyrhills. They actually donated it to the Boys Village, and then they were able to deed it over to Pasco County. One of the houses I mentioned that is subject to a lot of different tales is the Overstreet House at the Pioneer Museum. John Overstreet homesteaded the land. He was also in the Civil War. We didn't know until some of the more recent research that his young teenage son was killed, and his wife died in the house, and there are many sightings over time. There's sightings also in stories about the Enterprise Church at the museum, and I think those are the two main locations at the museum. Another interesting story is that of Robert Duke Bradley, and this also involves the Seminole Wars. His homestead is now owned by the Screamageddon, the recreational park that is there. It's a seasonal kind of park, and it's really grown to quite a bit of fame. They've called me several times. They've been trying to document the exact homestead. We know that it was there, but it again was a massacre. Two of the, well, not really a massacre, but two of the Bradley children were killed, and they claim that often that is a kind of a nighttime and evening. There's a little bit of a haziness there because it's a low area where the homestead was actually located, and supposedly they see these two figures, which may, it's believed by some to be the teenage son that was killed by the Seminoles, and the young daughter who was also killed, Mary Jane. The Edwinola has so much history, it would take me another book to write, but there have been so many sightings of ghosts at the Edwinola Hotel. It was built in 1912, and I believe that perhaps the original owner, which was Seymour Giroux, who fell off of the third story at the building of the house, may be the origin of some of these stories. That's my own theory. But workers there, a lot of different people have supposedly seen a female ghost in a blue dress. By the way, in my research, I noticed that a lot of people seem to equate ghosts with women in white dresses for whatever reason. There are also some very interesting stories about the Edwinola and the culture of Dade City. I'll just be honest and say that one of my dear friends says, having grown up in Dade City and then leaving Dade City and coming back, it went from the culture of The Help, the movie The Help, in terms of social divisions and racial divisions, to a much more progressive location. And I mention that because there is a fairly well-documented lynching that occurred on the grounds of the Edwinola Hotel, and certainly some of the most beautiful, elegant stories of life there. Groups that met there, people getting off to have lunch there from their train rides, being greeted by butlers, dining in the beautiful restaurant. But it holds a very diverse and broad history. And you'll find, if you read my book, several stories. A young gentleman that Brian Swan from the museum told me about was Jeff Jeter. I loved his story. This is a poem that he wrote for, let's see if I can move this so you can see it a little bit better. I don't think I can move it, but you should have access to this later. It's a poem that he wrote for one of the writing groups at St. Leo College. One of my youngest daughter went to preschool here, and the building was originally, it was moved across town similar to our building. But it was moved from Pasco, the area of Pasco Packing, and it had been used as a tavern and an hourly brothel, trying to think of the terminology to use here, and it was moved across town, and it sits beside the Adventist Hospital in Dade City on Fort King Road. Jeff, who has lived there and he inherited the house and he adores and loves the house, says there are lots of unexplained noises, lots of unexplained things, lots of stories that have been told. And I love this particular picture of the rainbow over the house, which kind of goes along with it. The Brown House on River Road has a lot of stories. It was built, gosh, in the late 1800s. They used it recently for the filming of the horror movie Preach, in conjunction with the movie that was done. Part of the movie filming was done at the Pioneer Museum as well. But it has a lot of interesting stories, some really cute little vignettes, and it is more of a traditional cracker type house. Here's some of the filming of the recent movie that was done there. One of the cute little stories that Bill Smith told me was about a house close to the Sistrunk House on Church Street. And it was actually an orange grove in that area, and it was built, but a story of a child that fell from a balcony there, and other children claimed that they saw him peeking out of the window. A gentleman from Dade City named Clinton Inman, who is a retired art teacher, created some of the artwork for my book. When I explained to him via Bill Dayton and a couple of other people what the house was supposedly look like, it no longer exists. It would have been across from the track at Pasco Elementary School on 14th Street. But Clinton Inman was able to recreate some of the things. I'll show you some of his other artwork in a minute. I didn't. One of the areas in West Pasco that I really enjoyed finding out about was the Moon Lake Gardens and Dude Ranch. Although we have not been able to definitively document that he was there, there are continuous rumors that Al Capone spent some time there. This was during Prohibition, so this extraordinary horticultural facility, and they had horses for trail rides. It was just the cat's meow in that period of time. Has many stories about other gangsters that we do know and are documented that were there, but not definitively Al Capone, but the story lives on. I have some other pictures of the Moon Lake Dude Ranch that I'll show you as we go along. I was fairly certain with Extraordinary Church Street and those beautiful houses that there must be a couple of stories there. One I mentioned with the Sistrunk House and one nearby. Also the Hudson family that was referenced by Bill earlier have a house very close there. That was in the Hudson family. But a lady that I have just admired over time was a lady named Winifred Bridge. Sometimes you find people in history that were born at the wrong time, and I think Winifred was one of those people. The family moved to the area after the Civil War, and her father had been a fairly well-known soldier, high-ranking soldier in the Union, and he was not well received initially in Dade City because of that and the Reconstruction and that kind of thing. But Winifred was just phenomenal beyond her time. She spent a lot of her young years caring for her aging parents. She was an only child. She ended up marrying the Presbyterian minister when she was in her 50s and had sort of a lonely time, but many of her writings and her paintings and her drawings are at the Pioneer Museum. But it is believed that her house was always it's no longer standing. It was right across the street from the Presbyterian church, and this is the house. But it was believed for many years it was a haunted house. It was actually somewhat of a woman that, I want to say it was kind of like Mrs. Haversham's house, or Mrs. Haversham, and her life was not completely realized. But she was a columnist for the Tampa Tribune and just created so many wonderful things, and her students wrote of her as well. That's one of those houses that may have been called haunted, but it perhaps had another story. Some of the other places in Dade City, at Aaron's Cutoff, it was known as Dixon's Hill. We found out later on, but there was an attack that was shared in 1927 in which a person that was coming from the stage, there was a stagecoach route in that area along what is now Land of Lakes, and he stopped to camp and he was devoured while he was asleep by a Florida panther. It's kind of a creepy story, but kind of fits the genre. I had several stories about cemeteries, and the only one that I included was one from Mount Zion Cemetery, because I had 3 different accounts of marching Confederate ghosts, soldier ghosts. Another one of a burial that took place there that was kind of interesting. Just a variety of ones, but I would invite you to take a look at this cemetery. It's large contingent of Confederate soldier burials. Just an extraordinary and interesting place. One of the stories that was told to me was by a man in his 60s, a graduate of Pasco High School, and he and his buddies had an interesting encounter there as teens that they was so spooky that they didn't talk about the remainder of their friendship over the years. One of them has passed away, but I asked him so many questions, but finally I just believed his story from his vigor in telling the story and his sincerity. I included in the book the filming of Edward Scissorhands. Some of this took place at a housing complex in Land O'Lakes, and some of it took place off of Blanton Road. Two people, Ted Johnson and the other one was Leslie Gilmore, shared just phenomenal stories with me. And as you would have it in a typical Pasco County story, Leslie took a lot of pictures. She was the banquet manager at Saddlebrook, and the stars of this show, including Johnny Depp and several others, were housed there. And she took several pictures. One of the pictures she exhibited at the Pasco County Fair that particular year and won first place. Ted Johnson was a deputy with the sheriff's department, and they needed security, so he worked the site for a long time, told me all kinds of stories about the various guests and stars and so on. Here's Ted. This was a phenomenal movie. It was somewhat of a horror movie. It's kind of like Pasco's own Frankenstein in a way, but it was a different twist on the ghost story. Lake Pasadena had lots of stories. I think probably that community had the worst luck of about any community in the area. They were in high consideration for the county seat. The hotel at Lake Pasadena, there were actually two hotels, one near the train station and then the huge, phenomenal hotel burned on New Year's Eve. And if you read some of the accounts of that, it is unbelievable. And it was frequented by people from around the country. It was the place to be, but it never really gained momentum after the fire that took place. And that also was an area of tremendous Indian grounds. In West Pasco, the Hacienda Hotel, which has recently been restored, has been the subject of ghost tours. I spent some time with the lady conducting the tour here, which was Nicole Farrow. I had a lot of fun learning about her equipment, learning about her stories. It was surprisingly interesting and informative, and I enjoyed Nicole a lot. Dade City Courthouse has some stories. Grace Evans, I believe, maybe the ghost that haunts the Dade City Courthouse. You'll need to look up this story. It's quite an interesting story. It's an interesting story of women's rights. I recently met her great-granddaughter and we shared some stories. I love this particular picture of the Dade City Courthouse because the building on the left is the original building that was the wooden building that preceded it. And as far as we know, this is the only photo of it. At the time, I didn't have the photo, and I asked Clinton again if he would recreate it for me. So you see these beautiful photos he recreated. One is the Ritchie Theater in Dade City. The one in the middle is the Bradley homestead, which was massacred. And I mentioned the 2 children were killed, and the other is the Dade City Courthouse. He just does phenomenal work. He's been doing a lot of work for the depot, for Joy Lynn as well. Many of you know that there was a POW camp in Dade City, and it was controversial at the time. Most of the soldiers were from the AFRICOR, And they were here for 2 years. They worked at Pasco Packing and Coomer's Mill and Lacucci and other places. There was a particular story that I included in the book, and it was from one of the POWs who came back to visit the area many years later in the 1980s. He had communicated with historian Eddie Herman for quite some time, and he came back to find the young lady who had brought him food at the very end of their imprisonment there. After the armistice had been called, they were pretty scarce on food, and this particular young woman had brought food to them, baked goods and so on, and he wanted to find her, and he shared his story in a letter form, and I thought it sort of fit in the book. This is the area, and there was a lot of publication in the newspapers, although they were very well treated, and it's pretty well documented that this was one of the better places to be a POW. There was still a lot of, fear of the Germans, a lot of propaganda and so on that was going on. So it wasn't a piece of cake. This area was honored by the historical committee that Scott Black chaired for many years from the county commission, and there is a monument in that area, a marker in that area. In Wesley Chapel, there's a place called the Enchantment, and it's been there for many years. It's by an artist that moved there after being in Miami for quite some time. His name is Louis Vanderkar. He's since passed away, but we spent some time with his grandson, who took us on a tour of the area. Louis was a character, if there ever was one, and I don't know how much of it his belief in the paranormal kinds of things in life was true, or just the kind of personality that he was. Spent a lot of time with my Wesley Chapel book, and also with this kind of documenting some of the things he did. He was known for his phenomenal Halloween parties. Used to be, when I was teaching at Zephyrhills High, I'd hear all kinds of stories about his Friday night parties and so on. But ghosts, all kinds of things. He's been compared with Picasso, just a variety of different artists, and he is pretty well known. B.C. Mannion and I talked about doing a story on his artistic work at some point, but these are some of the sculptures that are there. He was known as, he called himself a warlock, by the way. My favorite statue was the one of the thumbs up, which he did in honor of the Olympic team that was, several were killed in Munich, if you remember, I believe in the 1980s, and he did this as a commemoration for them. He was a veteran, but he happened to just believe in some of the more interesting forms of beliefs. So. The Dupree Gardens in the Land O'Lakes areas are sometimes known to be haunted. This was a phenomenal horticultural exhibit in our history. I included several stories from the Road to Nowhere in Wesley Chapel, which is now Bruce B. Downs. There were numerous murders, all kinds of events that took place there. It was a hurricane evacuation route that was started by Hillsborough County, and then there was a dispute between Hillsborough and Pasco, and it took years for them to finish this, but there are all kinds of tales and all kinds of situations that occur there. Certainly some that are pretty scary. Trilby doesn't escape the story. Scott Black's mother, Martha Black, wrote a column for the newspaper Between Fact and Fantasy, and she wrote about Scott's childhood home in Trilby, said to be the haunted house of Trilby. Also, Scott shared a wonderful story about the Trilby Methodist Church. They had done renovation over about 50 years, 40 years, and some of the renovation, I guess it's before they had permits and building departments, And they were in one service on a Sunday morning, and they were singing a particularly poignant hymn, and the ceiling fell down on them. And they always thought perhaps there was some kind of divine intervention there. The Hacienda Hotel and the Megan Theater I mentioned, again, painting by Clinton Inman. This was the period of, these were built in a period of the beginnings of the silent film industry. And it's said that there's a particular seat in the Ritchie Fundamental Theater, which is haunted. And I went over and took a look at it and so on. But you'll see, this is the gentleman that's featured, and he was such a phenomenal person in terms of volunteering and resurrecting the Ritchie Theater. I think they may believe that they just couldn't function without him. So his seat has taken on a ghostly phenomenon. The Centennial Land Office was one of the places I was guided to, and they were great to take me along. Derek Ponslitz has an investment firm there, but here's a case where Nicole Farrow was showing me their filming that they use. As I mentioned, this is the era of the Great Gatsby, and there was a beautiful mansion. Part of it's still there. The swimming area is still there. There were just some beautiful love stories between Thomas Magnum and Frances Rang. And it, again, lent itself beautifully to the book. I mentioned the Jeffries house in Zephyrhills. I'm so proud of the Zephyrhills Council because they just bought the carriage house that was attached to the Jeffries house, and they're renovating it as well. But it's just a wonderful classic example of a house built in 1910, occupied by Captain Jeffries. Here's Captain Jeffries and his wife. Annie Westerman shared a lot of stories with me, but there were lots of things that happened there. The house is out of plumb, like many houses would be of that age, but books falling off shelves, quiet whispers in the night, all kinds of interesting stories you can read about. In Dade City, I heard many people tell me stories about Annetta's Antiques, this wonderful gift shop and antique shop in Dade City that just recently closed a couple of years ago. But I heard from probably 5 different sources about sometimes things would be moved or whatever, kind of some fun stories. Used to be a really nice place to go to. Crystal Springs is featured in the book because many people believe that the famous Crystal Springs was like a fountain of youth. And they also found phenomenal artifacts of prehistoric animals there. It was a socialist colony, and so there are lots of stories about that too, and I just touch on them a bit in the book. Several stories about supposedly the haunted Withlacoochee Forest. Ernie and I went out venturing in the Withlacoochee Forest. Not that I haven't been trail riding out there before, but it is one of the most dense and interesting forests around. So the young man that shared some stories with me, it's a more modern story, but you might find it interesting. There was an Army air base in Zephyrhills in the beginning of World War II, and they were training pilots very, very quickly. And because they were training them, they were flying Marauders and Mustangs, and there was not great visibility in the airplane. There were lots of crashes that occurred, and there were 2 phenomenal crashes that occurred in the area. One occurred in the Cruisin Ranch, and the other one occurred closer to San Antonio. And in the one in the Cruisin Ranch, all of the crew was killed but one. And the crash that occurred in San Antonio, both the 2 pilots were killed in the Mustang. But somehow, because of my research, I was, these are the actual Army surveillance photos that were housed at MacDill Air Force Base, and they were only just recently released. And it took me a long time to convince the Cruzen family that indeed it did occur, because at that time it was really secretive. And the niece of this young man, John Ligon, who was killed in the crash, did a memorial ceremony last year for him and the other airmen that were killed in that crash. And we were able to go to MacDill and attend that. But I think if anywhere would have the presence of someone, it would be there. Here are some of the folks at the Army Air Base at MacDill that we attended. In fact, one of the gentlemen who's been doing a lot of the research had shirts made in honor of it. Those are two really hallowed pieces of ground in Pasco County. Here's a couple other pictures of the Moon Lake Dude Ranch I mentioned. Okay, I would invite you to take a look at the book, and if you'd like any information about pressing plants or drying plants, we'd be glad to share that information. If you're interested in any work on genealogy or just writing up some local history, I continue to do a lot of interviews and write occasionally for some of the area newspapers. So if you have a story to share, I'd be so pleased to share it with you. Thank you so very much. I don't know if I was taping it though.